Few comments there from the federal government on the status of trade talks between Canada and the U.S. just one day after President Trump revived the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state. Since Prime Minister Mark Carney's self-imposed deadline, August the 1st, to reach a deal came and went, talks are ongoing, but progress appears stalled, with Trump slapping new tariffs just this week on industries like softwood lumber. Let's bring back our front bench: Sharon Carr, Laura D'Angelo, Jamie Allerton, and Sebastian Skamsky. A lot of the back and forth today, Jamie, reminded me how little we know about what is actually happening. And I understand part of that is, you know what I mean? Like, I understand part of that is a strategy, but part of it feels, I guess, like we're in the dark about something that we are day in and day out told is like an existential threat to our economic survival. Do you think there needs to be more transparency? Do you expect any more transparency? What do you think is going on here?
Yeah, I think I'd first say shout out to Tawna McCharles at the Toronto Star. She had a pretty in-depth feature kind of lacing that through and taking her readers to that exact dynamic. I think this government feels like they broadly still have Canadians on their side, and they're happy to have people continue to kind of murmur at the margins that they need to do more while ultimately putting all of their stock into the budget. The fact they've kicked it from the fall to October to now actually November kind of shows that they're going to try and ride this out as long as possible. And I think this is ultimately where the clash between Prime Minister Carney's technocratic instincts and the kind of CEO of Canada, as he's kind of embodied himself by sharing very little, is going to clash with the reality of politics. You saw Premier Smith and Premier Eby in your last guest talk kind of what those divisions are. Supply management reports, Minister LeBlanc, of course, said that's not on the table, but we know they've actually expanded quota and market access, even if marginally, with past trade agreements. So the fact that he says it's not on the table, quite frankly, totally bogus. Don't believe him. And so a lot of this kind of these internal conflicts and contrarian kind of paths that can't coexist are going to kind of come to a head. But I think politically, this government is betting that they have the leeway to at least get through to their budget before they actually have to deal with the consequences.
Do you think they do, Sharon? Have that leeway?
I think there's a bit of leeway. I think we can do two things at one time, right? The conversations with the U.S. are going to continue, and I do think that there is a strategy here the Prime Minister is using, and not everyone is probably going to like that, but the strategy here is not to be negotiated in public, specifically not him to be negotiating in public. So we see Donald Trump is going to continue, and the president's going to continue to say things, and he re-brought up the whole idea of a 51st state yesterday, but I think the most important thing for Prime Minister Carney is to not react. He's got a budget coming up on November 4th, I believe, which is going to be probably his first real moment where he can define himself different from the previous government in showing how his spending is different and his focus is different. So I think there's a bit of a leeway here in the sense that we're doing two things at one time, but time is going to tell. And again, Donald Trump can come out and say something completely ridiculous again at some point that's going to require our government to step in and do something. But for now, I think the conversations are happening and the Prime Minister is engaged. But his strategy has very solely been not to negotiate in public. And I think for the most part, we know that works. It didn't work with Trudeau and it didn't work with Minister Freeland and folks back in the day. And we saw how detrimental that was. And I think this is the path forward.
My thing, Sebastian, though, is like I'm not asking anyone to negotiate in public, and I do understand the impulse not to be reactionary, right, and not to further inflame things. But like we just had a campaign based almost solely on this issue, and we have no idea if anything is happening behind it. Like I'm telling you, to the point where a reporter asked the Prime Minister, "Have you spoken to Trump today?" He said yes, and then a series of follow-up questions ensued, like very complex ones, like when. Before or after the UN, and like we couldn't even get an answer in response to that.
Well, Vashi, I mean, first of all, I just want to point out it was Prime Minister Carney that set out his own deadline for a deal with President Trump, which has come and gone, and seemingly nothing has occurred with it. So he has actually, when convenient for him, tried to bring this into the public forum. To that point, I think, I'm glad there were journalists who were yelling questions and asking the Prime Minister for a change to give us some updates. He did some days ago, I think, also deliver a perplexing response about who he met with in the UK, where he almost seemed bothered to be asked what it is that he is actually doing on these trips that he's taking around the world. Yeah, I mean, look, we may not know what is happening in those behind-the-scenes conversations. What we do know is what is happening in our own country and in the domestic space that Prime Minister Carney does have control over. And if that is any indication of how our international politics are being conducted, then I'm very, very afraid for our economic future. It is incumbent on Prime Minister Carney to set the right conditions in our country for that business investment that we just talked about in the previous segment that Premier Smith just spoke to you about. And that is absolutely not happening. There are so many things that we can do internally in our own country to prepare ourselves for whatever may come with President Trump or with any other country we set to trade with. And none of that is happening. Right. And so I think that that's a failing grade. And I'm, as I said, very worried that we're on track to not be passing on the international scene either.
I think that the liberals, and Laura, you can say that you can defend it, more adequately than I can. They would counter that, like the building blocks are being put in place, particularly when it comes to the international relationships. And again, like I have some sympathy for the idea that this stuff doesn't happen overnight. That there's, you don't want to be reactionary, but I just don't know, like. Who are we bringing along in this? You said you would stand up. I don't know how that is happening. Now supply management could be on the table. Then publicly they're saying it's not. Like, these are big sectors and people whose lives will be impacted. I wonder, like, how long it stays like this.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things there, right? I actually don't disagree to your point that Canadians need some words of comfort, right? These are a lot of jobs. The economy is scary. Like, I actually don't disagree that it would be nice to get a weekly, things are going,
even monthly at this
exactly,
point would be nice.
We're negotiating. But the not negotiating in public part of this is very real. And we have seen Donald Trump be so reactionary and so volatile that part I do think is real. And I respect the Prime Minister's decision to keep those conversations private. To your point about it takes time to build things, like I'm not really sure if people, want a switch to be flipped and all of a sudden everything changes, right? That's not how it works. The Prime Minister is traveling around the world to try to diversify our trade and try to build relationships so that we are less reliant on the U.S. That takes time. They aren't overnight, all of a sudden everything's going to change and investors are just going to flood here, right? You have to build those markets, build those relationships. And I would argue that the Prime Minister is taking time to do that in a way that I think Canadians understand.
We'll see, right? I mean, the promise was, we're going to do it. So we'll see. Okay, I got to leave it there. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to our front bench.